Physical Gold Fund presents the Gold Chronicles with Jim Rickards. Insights and analysis about economics, geopolitics, global finance, and gold. Hello, I'm John Ward on behalf of Physical Gold Fund. We're delighted to welcome you to our latest webinar with Jim Rickards in the series we're calling the Gold Chronicles. Jim Rickards is a New York Times best-selling author and the Chief Global Strategist for West Shore Funds. He's the former General Counselor of Long-Term Capital Management, and he's a consultant to the U.S. intelligence community and to the Department of Defense. He's also an advisory board member of the Physical Gold Fund. Hello, Jim, and welcome.
Hi, John. Great to be with you.
And we also have with us Alex Stanzik of the Physical Gold Fund. Hello, Alex.
Hi, John. Great to be here.
Alex will be looking out for questions that come from you, our listeners. So let me just say that your questions for Jim Rickards today are more than welcome. You can post them at any point during the interview. You'll see a box on your screen for typing in your question. And as time allows, we'll do our best to respond to you. So, Jim, in the past we focused quite a lot of attention in our conversations on Russia and the Ukraine conflict because it's an issue with obviously huge economic and financial ramifications. But of course you could say the same of the Middle East, which today remains in a state of constant turmoil. And just since we last spoke, we have the approaching nuclear deal with Iran, we have a near meltdown in U.S.-Israel relations, we have Saudi military intervention in the Yemen, and we have ISIS setting up shop within a few miles of Damascus. My question to you at this point is a broad one. How does the crisis in the Middle East impact the global financial and economic picture?
Well, it's a great question, John, and a great way to frame the issue. It would be nice if these various crises were sequential so that we could have a crisis in Ukraine and then resolve it, and then have a crisis in the Middle East, et cetera. But they're not sequential. They're cumulative. We keep piling one on top of the other. So to address the question, right, let's talk about the Middle East, but bear in mind that nothing in Ukraine has really gone away. That's in a quiet period right now. There is some, there is a ceasefire, but there have been multiple ceasefires before that have broken down. So it wouldn't surprise anyone to see Ukraine spin out of control again. In fact, it probably will, but it's a little quieter right now, so let's go over to the current hot spot, which is the Middle East. So I want to talk a little bit about the geopolitics first and then bring it around to markets, because I know our purpose here is really to interpret these geopolitical events in terms of the impact they have on markets and investor portfolios, but that's impossible to do without setting the right geopolitical frame. So let's talk about just the geopolitics of it a little bit. Yemen is certainly the crisis du jour. I think listeners know what's going on there. There was never a lot of stability there to begin with, but the more Western-backed, Western-friendly government that had been a base for a lot of counter-terrorist operations for years, and certainly putting al-Qaeda on the run, drone missile operations, and other aspects of the war on terror, even though the White House doesn't call it the war on terror, had been operated out of Yemen. And recently there was a tribe, the Al-Houthis, backed by Iranians, backed by Shiite co-religionists who they've been around for a long time, but they've led an uprising and effectively deposed the government. They refer to the president of Yemen as the Western recognized president. Whenever you hear the phrase Western recognized, it's a pretty good sign that the guy's no longer recognized. He's probably on the run somewhere. But our favorite is now has left the building, as they used to say about Elvis. And what we have is an Iranian-backed government that little by little is taking control. But in the Middle East, nothing's ever easy or simple. There's a third faction, which is al-Qaeda. So you have an al-Qaeda group in the eastern part of Yemen. You have the Iranian-backed Shia group taking over most of the western and northern part of Yemen. And then you have little pockets of Western resistance, now really led by an Arab coalition, led by Saudi Arabia and Egypt, trying to hang on to some strategic locations in Aden and the western tip of Yemen. So it's very much of a mess. Remains to be seen how this is going to play out. But let's just signal the importance of it. So Yemen's a poor country. It's a poor region, but it's probably the poorest country in the region. Why do we care? Why is it so important? Well, I think listeners are familiar with the Straits of Hormuz. This is the choke point where oil leaving the Persian Gulf heading for Western markets or Asian markets has to pass through this fairly narrow stretch. And Iran controls one side of it. The other tip of it is Oman. But Iran certainly has the ability to at least try to interdict that traffic. And bear in mind that the oil coming out of the Gulf is not just Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran. All of that oil, or almost all of it, except for some that travels overland through Turkey, comes out through the Straits of Hormuz. So you could really choke off the world's oxygen supply, if you will, in energy space if you interdicted that. That's well known, and the United States Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain, fairly nearby, and able to, if Iran did try to choke that off, they could probably reopen it, although it would be quite tumultuous in the meantime. But there's another choke point. Once you come out of the Straits of Hormuz and you get into the Arabian Sea, where do you go from there? Well, some of the traffic goes east to China. There are other choke points over there, but a lot of it heads west through the entrance to the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean and to Europe. Well, there's another choke point at the mouth of the Red Sea, and that's where Yemen is. And so now we have the prospect of Iran not only controlling half of one choke point at the Straits of Hormuz, but if Yemen falls to pro-Iranian factions, Iran would effectively control the other choke point at the entrance to the Red Sea. They would have two choke points. Now, if they want to cut off the Western world oil supply, and if they controlled, obviously they've got Iran and the Straits of Hormuz, but if they also controlled Yemen and the entrance to the Red Sea, they could interdict it at two places, which means the Fifth Fleet would have to divide its forces and fight two battles in two different places. Obviously, that's anyone with any military background knows it's always more difficult to fight two actions than one because of the inability to concentrate forces. The U.S. Sixth Fleet, sad to say, so gee, why doesn't the Sixth Fleet just come down from the Med through the Suez Gulf and help out there? That's a nice thought, but we don't have a Sixth Fleet. We have a Sixth Fleet in name only. The Sixth Fleet today, which is based in the Mediterranean, consists of one flagship and whoever is in the neighborhood. So if anybody from any aircraft carriers or any traffic having to be traversing in the Med, they're temporarily assigned to the Sixth Fleet, but there's not much besides that. So the Sixth Fleet is a bit of a phantom. The Fifth Fleet is real, but if they had to divide their forces, they'd have their hands full. So that's the strategic play. So Iran is trying to basically improve its ability to choke off the oil supply. Now, at the same time, and here I want to step back from the situation in Yemen. I don't want to spend too much time on what I call the crisis du jour, but help listeners look at the bigger picture. At the same time, Iran is building what's called the Shiite Crescent, starting in Iran, traversing now Iraq. Iraq used to be more Sunni and or secular Ba'athist. Today it's pretty much fallen to Iran and the Shia. So from Iran through Iraq into Syria, which is propped up by Iran, and then through Hezbollah into Lebanon to the Mediterranean. Of course, Hezbollah is basically an Iranian proxy army. So you have this prospect of Shia influence stretching from the Arabian Sea to the Mediterranean via Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Oh, by the way, completely encircling Israel, and all they have to do, all that remains to be done is peel off Jordan. And of course, there are plenty of Shia co-religionists of Iran, agents in place in eastern Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. So Israel is feeling encircled. Saudi Arabia is feeling encircled with what's going on in Yemen, because Yemen's on the southern flank of Saudi Arabia. They're already confronting Iran across the Persian Gulf. Plenty of Iranians or Iranian agents in, as I mentioned, eastern Saudi Arabia, where the oil is, and Bahrain, which I've been to recently. I'll be heading back there soon. So Iran is encircling Saudi Arabia, encircling Israel, making huge strategic gains. And what's the United States doing? Well, the United States is making friends with Iran. We are their new BFFs, best friends forever. The president started the process of détente with Iran in December 2013 when he relieved some, not all, economic sanctions on Iran. And since then, we've been in these negotiations over the nuclear dossier, basically Iran's enrichment capability. There was some kind of breakthrough announced about a week ago. It looks like, I wouldn't even call it an agreement to agree. It's sort of a memorandum of a framework of an agreement to agree. So whatever that is, that's what the president announced. The Iranians are already disputing the White House version of it, so take your pick. Not much of this is in writing, and all of it remains to be seen. And it all hinges on the ability to conduct inspections. We're letting Iran keep the centrifuges. We're letting Iran keep the enriched uranium, relying on their promise to not enrich or create enough uranium to build very many nuclear weapons. That depends, since they're not giving up the material or the equipment, it depends on inspections. And the inspections are carried out under United Nations supervision, which is subject to Security Council sanctions, and Russia has a veto on the Security Council. So we're kind of depending on our good friend Putin to make sure Iran plays straight. I don't know how comfortable people feel with that. A good friend of mine, Charlie Delfer, wrote a column on this in Politico recently and pointed this out. No one knows more about weapons of mass destruction and inspections than Charlie Delfer. Charlie was the U.S. representative on UNSCOM in the 1990s, when last time we tried this routine with sanctions on Iraq, which broke down, pretty quickly. Charlie was one of the few people who actually interrogated Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was in captivity before he was executed after they dug him out of a spider hole in Iraq. So Charlie got to interrogate Saddam face-to-face across the table, and as I say, knows more about this than anyone. And he's very, very skeptical of our ability to enforce these sanctions on Iran. It's no wonder that Israel feels uncomfortable. The president gave an interview with Tom Friedman of the New York Times recently in which he outlined the Obama doctrine, which is pretty fuzzy. He said, you really have to parse words with the president. The president said, I promise that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon on my watch. And that phrase, on my watch, of course, set off alarm bells around the world, because his watch ends January 21st, 2017. So it's nice to know that Iran won't get a nuclear weapon before then. But there's a lot, there's the rest of history beyond that. So the president, this has been a strategy all along to basically make sure that his legacy or his administration goes down without Iran getting a nuclear weapon, but he's selling out the future of the United States, selling out the future of Israel. He's sort of dumping it in the lap of his successor, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Jeb Bush or Rand Paul, Elizabeth Warren. I don't know who the next president's going to be, but whoever it is going to get this dumped into his or her lap, courtesy of Obama's unwillingness to really wrestle with the future of this. So I found that these are the president's words, not my words, but when he said, my watch, I didn't take a lot of comfort from that. He also said, if anyone messes with Israel, the U.S. will be there for them. Again, these are his exact words. Go read the Tom Friedman column in the New York Times. This is not me putting words in the president's mouth. These are the president's words. He said, if anyone messes with Israel, America will be there for them. Well, what the heck does that mean? The thing is, messing with Israel, if you drop one nuclear device in Tel Aviv, it's over. You've killed 1 million Jews just like that. It's the second Holocaust. 1 million Jews could be incinerated. That is the second Holocaust. Israel lacks what we call strategic depth. Strategic depth is why no one's ever really conquered Russia. Charles the 12th, the Swedish conqueror, attacked in the 17th century. Napoleon attacked in the 19th century. Adolf Hitler attacked in the 20th century, and all three of them failed to subdue Russia because they could drive 1,000 or 1,500 miles into Russian territory, but then the winter came and the Russians just retreated and waited them out, and supply lines got stretched, equipment froze, men got illness, and the army was decimated, and the Russians pushed back. So Russia can absorb tens of millions of casualties, and they're still standing because they have strategic depth. Israel does not have strategic depth. You go back to the original United Nations borders established in 1948, 47, 48. At the narrowest stretch was only 16 miles from Palestinian territory to the Mediterranean Sea. I've driven around Israel from top to bottom. You can do it in a day and a half. It's not much bigger than New Jersey. The point is, if Israel ever suffers a major attack, they have no fallback. There's no plan B. There's no day two. They're done. And so when the president says, if you mess with them, we're there for you, that's a meaningless promise, because Israel can't withstand a first strike. They've got to make sure the first strike never happens. So what can we say? Iran is encircling Saudi Arabia, who I guess used to be our friend. They're encircling Israel, who I guess used to be our friend. The president's engaged in happy talk about trusting people you can't trust, relying on Putin to do the enforcement at a time when he's calling, Putin all kinds of nasty things with regard to Ukraine, and saying nothing bad's going to happen on my watch, which is over in about 20 months. So there you are, a pretty unstable situation. And the way the president frames this, he says, well, if you don't like my policy, you're a warmonger, and you want to be responsible for boots on the ground and casualties. That's in analysis. That's what we call a false dichotomy or a straw man. He sets up his opponents to be these warmongers who want to drop the 82nd Airborne into Aleppo, or drop the 101st Airborne into Aden, and incur a lot of casualties. And that's a false choice. There's a lot of daylight between what I'll call appeasement on the one hand and war on the other. And there's no better example of that than the Cold War. Through the entire length of the Cold War, about 50 years from roughly 40 years from roughly 1949 to 1989, or 1947 to 1991, however you want to date it, 45 years, let's say. Russia and the United States never fired a shot at each other. There was no war between Russia and the United States, but there was a Cold War, and we used an array of policies. We used containment, we used proxies, we used sanctions, we used intelligence, we used a lot of assets, but we never went to war. Now, there's something in between appeasement on the one hand and war on the other, and it's smart policy, it's strategy. It's people like George Kennan and the Long Telegram and the X article in Foreign Affairs. It's things like that. That's kind of what's missing from this White House. It's either my way or the highway. So a very, very unstable, uncertain state of affairs. Now, let's take all that, which is bad enough, and kind of bring it over to markets. And I would want to say there are two big plays going on. The first involving the price of oil. And this may surprise some people, but what's going on with the price of oil actually has relatively little to do with everything we just went through with all this geopolitical uncertainty, at least for the time being. That's a different play. That has to do with pricing, fracking, market share, and Saudi Arabia's efforts to put the frackers out of business. And I've said this before, and I think listeners may be familiar with this analysis, but Saudi Arabia needed to pick a price that was low enough to put the frackers out of business, but high enough to sustain their revenues and their budget requirements, or at least not any lower than it needed to be, to put the frackers out of business. It's an optimization problem, but that number is $60 a barrel. That's low enough to kill the frackers and high enough to keep Saudi Arabia's budget in a slight surplus. Now, that doesn't mean you stick the landing. It doesn't mean the price of oil is exactly $60. Markets overshoot. They trade in a range. There's day-to-day volatility. There are a lot of other things going on, but I look for oil to trade in a $50 to $60 range, with 60 kind of being the cap, and 50 being, not a hard floor, but, a place that the price would gravitate to for the rest of this year and most of next year, because it's going to take that long to put the frackers out of business. So does Iran get hurt by that? Yeah, a little. Does Russia get hurt by that? Sure. And Saudi Arabia doesn't mind either one of those two things. But that's not primarily why they're doing it. They're primarily doing it to maintain market share. And it's important to understand the unique role of Saudi Arabia. I mean, people always talk about OPEC. OPEC is not that important. Saudi Arabia is vitally important because they have a unique combination. They have the largest reserves and the largest potential output and the lowest cost of production. That's a unique combination. Other people have a lot of oil at very high prices. Other people have oil at low prices, but not that much in reserves, so they've got to worry about depletion. I mean, other oil producers have one of the three, or maybe two of the three factors to worry about. Saudi Arabia doesn't. They've got all the reserves, all the capacity, and a very low production costs all at the same time. So they can set the price of oil. They can set it wherever they want. If Saudi Arabia wants oil to be $15 a barrel, they can do it. They just have to pump like crazy and fill up. We're already seeing storage capacity, completely filled up, floods of oil coming on the market, and if Saudi Arabia wants to add to that, they can drive the price down. On the other hand, if Saudi Arabia wants to shut off the taps, they can take the price to $150 a barrel tomorrow. So in a huge range from let's say $10 or $15 to $150 or $200, Saudi Arabia can set the price, and so the price is whatever they want it to be. And right now, as I say, they want it to be in this $50 to $60 range. Now, not forever. They like $100 oil as much as the next producer, but they have to sink the frackers. Now, the difficulty there is the frackers don't fall off their tents overnight. Fracking's got a couple interesting properties. One is the wells have a much higher degree of finding oil. The old wildcat days when you drilled a bunch of wells and most of them came out dry, and every now and then you hit a gusher, and that's how you made all your money. Those days are over, at least with fracking technology. You have a very high probability of finding oil, but the depletion rate is much faster. Those wells tend to get depleted or dried up faster, and so the solution is to keep drilling new wells, and that's kind of how you can understand the dynamic of the fracking industry. But to drill new wells, you need money. You got to buy pipe and rigs and get labor and buy leases and do all kinds of things. And so you have this unique situation where most fracking is not profitable at $50 to $60 a barrel. It needs prices of 80 upwards of $130 a barrel. I mean, so I'm sure somebody can point to some field somewhere where the price is lower, but most of it is in that $80 to $130 range I just described. And so nobody's going to go out and drill for oil at when the cost is $80 a barrel if the price is $50 a barrel. That's crazy. So they're not going to do new wells. Now, if you've got existing wells, the math is different because you've got some costs. You might not have done it in hindsight, but you did it. You've got that well. And so you've got all this debt that you incurred on the assumption of higher oil prices that you borrowed the money to drill all the wells you've got. So you're going to pump like crazy in the existing wells to generate cash flow to pay your bills, but you're not going to do new wells until the price goes up, which it won't because Saudi Arabia is going to hold it down. So in that world, you get a short-term flood of oil as you pump the wells like crazy, but you get a long-term drying up of the industry because those wells will deplete quickly and no one's building new ones. That's going to take 1.5 to 2 years to play out, so that's why I see it in this range for a while. But eventually, the fracking will dry up, and then Saudi Arabia will start to raise the price again. And people say, oh, well, how does that work? If they raise the price, don't the frackers just go back in business? And the answer might be no for two reasons. One, they're going to have to borrow the money again, and there might be a lot of bad debts in the meantime. There might be trillions of dollars of write-offs of that fracking industry junk debt as a result of the new low price of oil. So maybe the lenders aren't so willing to make new loans, or the junk bond buyers, some of whom are, unbeknownst to them, if you look in your 401ks, you might find some of this fracking junk bond in some of your so-called high yield funds in your 401ks. So don't be surprised if you don't own some yourself, but once those losses come in, people might not be so eager to make new loans. But beyond that, even if you could find credit-worthy projects, you really want to go there because Saudi Arabia could just, wash, rinse, and repeat and lower the price again. And so this is Saudi Arabia's, long-term play to put the frackers out of business and ultimately raise the price, regain market share, and regain revenue. So this is all going on independent of the chaos in the Middle East that we just described. But of course, one doesn't help the other. Now, just to kind of connect the dots a little bit, some people have said, well, if the U.S. has détente with Iran, doesn't that put a lot of Iranian oil back on stream, and doesn't that drive the price lower, maybe down to the $20 range, et cetera? And the answer to that is some Iranian oil might come back on stream. I think that's correct, but it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, a lot of these fields are they really need substantial upgrades. Look for a lot of Chinese capital coming in to do that. So yeah, there might be some more Iranian supply, and Iran is notorious for cheating, as is the rest of OPEC. But Saudi Arabia can just dial it down again. Maybe the frackers are coming off stream as Iran's coming on stream, and Saudi Arabia's just standing pat, waiting for all this to play out. So that's how that works. So again, I look for oil to trade in that range. This has very important implications for the Fed, by the way, just to tie it back to U.S. monetary policy, because, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later in the podcast, but the Fed discounts food and energy inflation or deflation, and they look at core CPI and core PCE for their guidance on price stability, which is part of their dual mandate. A lot of people laugh at that and they say, well, it's ridiculous. What's more important than food and energy? Why would you factor it out? Well, there's actually a good academic reason for doing it, because the time series of prices shows that those things are volatile. They do tend to be mean reverting. They do tend to come back to where the core is. So in the long run, they're the same or close to the same. Then it makes some sense to ignore them in the short run because you're just sort of filtering out the noise. In other words, a core CPI is a good proxy for overall CPI over a longer time period. However, it might be different this time because if the price of oil is going down, not for normal industrial supply and demand reasons, but because of a large market share play by Saudi Arabia, that means it goes down and it doesn't come back up. It means it's not mean reverting. It's actually manipulated by the Saudis. So that might be sending out false signals to the Fed. The Fed might be thinking that inflation is going to tick up to their goal, when in fact they've got to first absorb the deflation and secondly not see the bounce back, not see the mean reverting behavior, which as usual with the Fed models, they're going to get it wrong. and possibly overestimate the tendency towards future inflation or changing inflationary expectations. And that's extremely dangerous because that might actually prompt them to raise rates at exactly the wrong time. Of course, the Fed has a long history of doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. So that makes it dangerous. So I'll stop there. I know we've got a couple more questions, but we've got a big picture, long-term geopolitical mess with instability. By the way, if oil does bounce out of that $50 to $60 range I spoke about, if it does, it would be because of a geopolitical wild card, something going very badly wrong. And given the mess I described, you can't rule that out. By the way, just one last footnote. I talked about the Shiite Crescent. I talked about the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, Yemen. Don't forget Libya. I mean, Libya is in chaos. There's active ISIS, active Al-Qaeda. ISIS is getting pledges from as far away as Nigeria at this point. So they're actually getting stronger, even as they suffer tactical defeats in places like Tikrit. They're making strategic gains around the world, so they're not going away. So you could see that wild card, but again, that's always a possibility. But I think oil will stay in the range. I think the Fed is overestimating the mean reverting behavior of oil prices. They'll probably get interest rate policy wrong, and that could be very damaging for markets around the world. So I'll stop there and throw it back to you, John.
Thank you, Jim. That's really a huge and complex and very informative picture. It's obviously these are big areas of discussion that we'll no doubt return to. You have been listening to The Gold Chronicles with Jim Rickards, presented by Physical Gold Fund. Recordings can be found at physicalgoldfund.com/podcasts. You can register there for news of upcoming interviews with Jim Rickards and other world-class thinkers.